Now, in the last lecture, we learned about refs, and I showed you that with refs, you have an alternative way of getting that user input, of accessing those input fields. And I also showed you this a little bit hacky approach of then still manipulating the input fields and resetting them if you want to do that. Now, this approach of using refs to interact with DOM elements, specifically with input elements, also has a special name. We're talking about uncontrolled components if we access values with a ref. So these input components here would now be uncontrolled components. Why uncontrolled? Because their internal state, so the value which is reflected in them, is not controlled by React. We rely on the default behavior of the input, where a user, of course, is able to enter something and that entered value is reflected. And we then just fetch it, yes, with a React feature, but we don't feed data back into the input. When I set a new value to those inputs here with this workaround, we're absolutely not using React here. Sure, we're using the ref, but in the end, we get access to the native DOM element with that, and I then just use the regular DOM API for setting the value of a DOM node, of an input DOM node. So that's why this is uncontrolled, because we're not controlling the state of the input element with React. Now, you can talk about uncontrolled and controlled components also in the context of other components. But most commonly, we have this scenario when we talk about input components, about form components in general. Because those components tend to have some internal state natively by the browser. An input element is configured to take user input and save and reflect it. And when we then work with those components in a React app, we want to connect our React state to that. That's why we typically have this controlled, uncontrolled thing when we work with input components in React. And when we use refs like we're doing it here, we have uncontrolled input components. The approach we had before, where we manage our state and we update that state on every keystroke and we feed that state back into the input with the value prop. So that approach we had before we added refs, that would be the controlled approach. Then we would say that those input fields are controlled components because their internal state is controlled by React. These are simply important terms which you should keep in mind for potential interviews or discussions with other React developers because they are typical terms you hear in the React world.